Randomized caching. We now discussed the use of randomization for the caching problems which we first encountered in Chapter 4. We begin by developing a class of algorithms system marking algorithms that include both deterministic and randomized approaches. After deriving a general performance guarantee that applies to all marking algorithms, we show how a strong guarantee can be obtained for a particular marking algorithm that exploits randomization. The problem. We begin by recalling the cache maintenance problem from Chapter 4. In the most basic setup, we consider a processor whose full memory has n addresses. It is also equipped with a cache containing k slots of memory that can be accessed very quickly. We can keep copies of k items from the full memory in the cache slots, and when a memory location is accessed, the processor will first check the cache to see if it can be quickly retrieved. We say the request is a cache hit if the cache contains the required item. In this case, the access is very quick. We say the request is a cache miss if the requested item is not in the cache. In this case, the access takes much longer, and moreover, one of the items currently in the cache must be evicted to make room for the new item. We will assume that the cache is kept full at all times. The goal of a cache maintenance algorithm is to minimize the number of cache misses, which are the truly expensive part of the process. The sequence of memory references is not under the control of the algorithm. This is simply dictated by the application that is running, and so the job of the algorithms we considered is simply to decide on an eviction policy. Which item currently in the cache should be evicted on each cache miss? In Chapter 4, we saw a greedy algorithm that is optimal for the problem. Always evict the item that will be needed the farthest in the future. While this algorithm is useful to have as an absolute benchmark on caching performance, it clearly cannot be implemented under real operating conditions. Since we don't know ahead of time when each item will be needed next, rather we need to think about eviction policies that operate online using only information about past requests without knowledge of the future. The eviction policy that is typically used in practice is to evict the item that was used the least recently, i.e., whose most recent access was the longest algorithm in the past. This is referred to as the least recently used, or LRU policy. The empirical justifications for LRU is that algorithms tend to have a certain locality in accessing data, generally using the same set of data frequently for a while. If a data item has not been accessed for a long time, this is a sign that it may not be accessed again for a long time. Here we will evaluate the performance of different eviction policies without making any assumptions, such as locality on the sequence of requests. To do this, we will compare the number of misses made by an eviction policy on a sequence delta with the minimum number of misses it is possible to make. With the minimum, we will use f of delta to denote this later quantity. It is the number of misses achieved by the optimal farthest in future policy. Comparing eviction policies to the optimal is very much in the spirit of providing performance guarantees for approximation algorithms, as we did in Chapter 11. Note, however, the following interesting difference. The reason the optimal was not attainable in our approximation analysis. From that chapter, assuming P is not equal to NP is that the algorithms were constrained to run in polynomial time. Here, on the other hand, the eviction policies are constrained in their pursuit of the optimal by the fact that they do not know the requests that are coming in the future. For eviction policies operating under this online constraint, it initially seems hopeless. To say something interesting about their performance, why couldn't we just design a request sequence that completely confounds any online eviction policy? The surprising point here is that it is in fact possible to give an absolute guarantees on the performance of various online policies relative to the optimum. We first show that the number of misses incurred by ORU on any request sequence can be bounded by roughly k times the optimal. We then use randomization to develop a variation on ORU that has an exponentially stronger bound on its performance. Its number of misses is never more than big O of log k times the optimal. Designing the class of marking algorithms. The bounds for both ORU and its randomized variant will follow from a general template for designing online eviction policies, a class of policies called marking algorithms. They are motivated by the following intuition. To do well against the benchmark of f of delta, we need an eviction policy that is sensitive to the differences between the following two possibilities. A. In the recent past, the request sequence has contained more than k distinct items, or B. In the recent past, the request sequence has come exclusively from a set of at most k items. In the first case, we know that f of delta must be increasing, since no algorithm can handle more than k distinct items without incurring a cache miss. But in the second case, it's possible that delta is passing through a long stretch in which an optimal algorithm need not incur any misses at all. It is here that our policy must make sure that it incurs very few misses. Guided by these considerations, we now describe the basic outline of a marking algorithm, which prefers evicting items that don't seem to have been used in a long time. Such an algorithm operates in phases. The description of one phase is as follows. Each memory item can be either marked or unmarked. At the beginning of the phase, all items are unmarked. On a request to item S, we mark S, and if S is in the cache, then evict nothing. Else S is not in the cache. In such a case, if all items currently in the cache are marked, then declare the phase over. Processing if S is deferred to start of next phase. Else evict an unmarked item from the cache. Note that this describes a class of algorithms rather than a single specific algorithm because the key step evict an unmarked item from the cache does not specify which unmarked item should be selected. We will see that eviction policies with the different properties and performance guarantees arise depending on how we resolve this ambiguity. We first observe that since a phase starts with all items unmarked, and items become marked only when accessed. The unmarked items have all been accessed less recently than the marked items. This is the sense in which a marking algorithm is trying to evict items that have not been requested recently. Also, at any point in a phase, if there are any unmarked items in the cache, then the least recently used item must be unmarked. It follows that the LRU policy evicts an unmarked item whenever one is available, and so we have the following fact. The LRU policy is a marking algorithm. Analyzing marking algorithms. We now described a method for analyzing marking algorithms ending with about on performance that applies to all marking algorithms. After this, when we add randomization, we will need to strengthen this analysis. Consider an arbitrary marking algorithm operating on a request sequence delta. For the analysis, we picture an optimal caching algorithm operating on delta alongside this marking algorithm. incurring an overall cost of f of delta. Suppose that there are gamma phases in the sequence delta as defined by the marking algorithm. To make the analysis easier to discuss, we are going to pad the sequence delta both at the beginning and the end with some extra requests. These will not add any extra misses to the optimal algorithm. That is, they will not cause f of delta to increase, and so any bound we show on the performance of the marking algorithm relative to the optimal for this padded sequence will also apply to delta. Specifically, we imagine a phase 0 that takes place before the first phase, in which all the items initially in the cache are requested once. This does not affect the cost of either the marking algorithm or the optimal algorithm. We also imagine that the final phase R ends with an epilogue in which every item currently in the cache of the optimal algorithm is requested twice in round-robin fashion. This does not increase f of delta, and by the end of the second pass through these items, the marking algorithm will contain each of them in its cache, and each will be marked. For the performance bound, we need two things: an upper bound on the number of misses incurred by the marking algorithm, and a lower bound saying that the optimal must incur at least a certain number of misses. The division of the request sequence delta into phases turns out to be the key to doing this. First of all, here is how we can picture the history of a phase from the marking algorithm's point of view. At the beginning of the phase, all items are unmarked. Any item that is accessed during the phase is marked, and it then remains in the cache for the remainder of the phase. Over the course of the phase, the number of marked items grows from 0 to k, and the next phase begins with a request to a k plus first item. Different from all of these marked items, we summarize some conclusions from this picture in the following claim. 13.35. In each phase, delta contains accesses to exactly k distinct items. The subsequent phase begins with an access to a different k plus first item. Since an item once marked remains in the cache until the end of the phase, the marking algorithm cannot incur a miss or an item more than once in a phase. Combined with 13.35, this gives us an upper bound on the number of misses incurred by the marking algorithm. 13.36, the marking algorithm incurs at most k misses per phase for a total of at most kr misses over all r phases. As a lower bound on the optimal, we have the following fact. 13.37, the optimal incurs at least r minus 1 misses. In other words, f of delta is greater than or equals to r minus 1. Proof: consider any phase but the last one, and look at the situation just after the first access to an item S in the phase. Currently, S is in the cache maintained by the optimal algorithm, and 13.35 tells us that the remainder of the phase will involve accesses to k-1 other distinct items, and the first access of the next phase will involve a kth other item as well. Let S be this set of k items other than little s. We note that at least one of the members of S is not currently in the cache maintained by the optimal algorithm, since with little s there, it only has room for k-1 other items. And the optimal algorithm will incur a miss the first time this item is accessed. What we've shown, therefore, is that for every phase j less than r, the sequence from the second access in phase j through the first access in phase j plus 1 involves at least one miss by the optimal. This makes for a total of at least r minus 1 misses. Combining 13.36 and 13.37, we have the following performance guarantee. 13.38, for any marking algorithm, the number of misses it incurs on any sequence delta is at most k times f of delta plus k. Proof: the number of misses incurred by the marking algorithm is at most kr, which is equals to k times r minus 1 plus k, which is less than equals to k times f of delta plus k, where the final inequality is just 13.37. Note that the plus k in the bound of 13.38 is just an additive constant, independent of the length of the request sequence delta, and so the key aspect of the bound is the factor of k relative to the optimal. To see that this factor of k is the best bound possible for some marking algorithms, and for LRU in particular, consider the behavior of LRU on a request sequence in which k plus 1 items are repeatedly requested in a round-robin fashion. LRU will each time evict the item that will be needed just in the next step, and hence it will incur a cache miss on each axis. It's possible to get this kind of terrible caching performance in practice for precisely such a reason. The program is executing a loop that is just slightly too big for the cache. On the other hand, the optimal policy, evicting the page that will be requested farthest in the future, incurs a miss only every k steps, so LRU incurs a factor of k more misses than the optimal policy. Designing a randomized marking algorithm. The bad example for LRU that we just saw implies that if we want to obtain a better bound for the online caching algorithm, we will not be able to reason about fully general marking algorithms. Rather, we will define a simple randomized marking algorithms and show that it never incurs more than big O of log k times the number of misses of the optimal algorithm, an exponentially better bound. Randomization is a natural choice in trying to avoid the unfortunate sequence of wrong choices in the bad example for LRU. To get this bad sequence, we needed to define a sequence that always evicted precisely the wrong item. By randomizing, a policy can make sure that, on average, it is throwing out an unmarked item that will at least not be needed right away. Specifically, where the general description of a marking contains the line, else evict an unmarked item from the cache, without specifying how this unmarked item is to be chosen. Our randomized marking algorithm uses the following rule: else evict an unmarked item chosen uniformly at random from the cache. This is arguably the simplest way to incorporate randomization into the marking framework. Analyzing the randomized marking algorithm. Now we'd like to get a bound for the randomized marking algorithm that is stronger than 13.38, but in order to do this, we need to extend the analysis in 13.36 and 13.37 to something more subtle. This is because there are sequences delta with R phases, where the randomized marking algorithm can really be made to incur KR misses. Just consider a sequence that never repeats an item. But the point is that on such sequences, the optimal will incur many more than R-1 misses. We need a way to bring the upper and lower bounds closer together based on the structure of the sequence. This picture of a runaway sequence that never repeats an item is an extreme instance of the distinction we like to draw. It is useful to classify the unmarked items in the middle of a phase into two further categories. We call an unmarked item fresh if it was not marked in the previous phase either, and we call it stale if it was marked in the previous phase. Recall the picture of a single phase that led to 13.35. The phase begins with all items unmarked and it contains accesses to k distinct items, each of which goes from unmarked to marked the first time it is accessed. Among these k accesses to unmarked items in phase J, let Cj denote the number of these that are to fresh items. To strengthen the result from 13.37, which essentially said that the optimal incurs at least one miss per phase, we provide about in terms of the number of fresh items in a phase. 13.39 f of delta is greater than or equals to 1/2 times the summations of Cj summing with index starting from 1 to r. Proof: let Fj of delta Fj of sigma denote the number of misses incurred by the optimal algorithm in phase J so that f of sigma is equals to the summations of Fj of sigma summing with index j starting from 1 to r. From 13.35, we know that in any phase J there are requests to k distinct items. Moreover, by our definition of fresh, there are requests to Cj plus 1 for the items in phase J plus 1. So between phases J and J plus 1, there are at least k plus Cj plus 1 distinct items requested. It follows that the optimal algorithm must incur at least Cj plus 1 misses over the course of phases J and J plus 1. So Fj of delta plus Fj plus 1 of delta is greater than or equals to Cj plus 1. This holds even for j equals to 0 since the optimal algorithm incurs C1 misses in phase 1. Thus we have the summations of Fj of delta plus Fj plus 1 of delta summing with index j starting from 0 to r minus 1 is greater than or equals to the summations of Cj plus 1 summing with index j starting from 0 to r minus 1. But the left-hand side is at most 2 times the summations of Fj of alpha delta summing with index j starting from 1 to alpha, which is equals to 2 times f of delta, and the right hand side is the summations of Cj summing with index j starting from 1 to alpha to r. We now give an upper bounds on the expected numbers of misses incurred by the randomized marking algorithm, also quantified in terms of the number of fresh items in each phase. Combining these upper and lower bounds will yield the performance guarantee we're seeking. In the following statement, let m delta denote the random variable equal to the number of cache misses incurred by the randomized marking algorithm on the request sequence delta. 13.40. For every request sequence delta, we have the expected numbers of m delta is less than or equals to h of k, where h is the harmonic function, times the summations of Cj summing with index starting from 1 to r. Proof: recall that we used the Cj to denote the number of requests in phase J to fresh items. There are k requests to unmarked items in a phase, and each unmarked item is either fresh or stale. So there must be k minus Cj requests in phase J to unmarked stale items. Let xj denote the number of misses incurred by the randomized marking algorithm in phase J. Each request to a fresh item results in a guaranteed miss for the randomized marking algorithm. Since the fresh item was not marked in the previous phase, it cannot possibly be in the cache when it is requested in phase J. Thus, the randomized marking algorithm incurs at least Cj misses in phase J because of requests to fresh items. Stale items, by contrast, are a more subtle matter. The phase starts with the k stale items in the cache. These are the items that were unmarked in mass at the beginning of the phase. On a request to a stale item S, the concern is whether the randomized marking algorithm evicted it earlier in the phase and now incurs a miss as it has to bring it back in. What is the probability that the ith request to a stale item, say S, results in a miss. Suppose that there have been C less than equals to Cj requests to fresh items thus far in the phase. Then the cache contains the C formerly fresh items that are now marked I-1, formerly stale items that are now marked, and K minus C minus I plus 1 items that are stale and not yet marked in this phase. But there are K minus I plus 1 items over O that are still stale, and since exactly K minus C minus I plus 1 of them are in the cache, the remaining of C of them are not. Each of the K minus I plus 1 stale items is equally likely to be no longer in the cache. And so S is not in the cache at the moment with probability C divided by K minus I plus 1, which is less than equals to Cj divided by K minus I plus 1. This is the probability of a miss on the request to S. Summing over all requests to unmarked items, we have that the expectation of xj is less than equals to cj plus the summations of cj divided by k minus I plus 1, summing with index I starting from 1 to k minus cj, which is less than equals to, if we take out the cj out of the summation term, there will be cj times the following formula: 1 plus the summations of 1 divided by L, summing with index L starting with cj plus 1 until L equals to k, which is equals to cj times 1 plus h of k minus h of cj, where the h is the harmonic function, and which is apparently less than equals to cj times h of k. Thus, the total expected number of misses incurred by the randomized marking algorithm is expectations of m delta is equals to the summations of expectations of xj, summing with index j starting from 1 to r, which is less than equals to h of k times the summations of cj, summing with index j starting from 1 to r. Combining 13.39 and 13.40, we immediately get the following performance guarantee. 13.41, the expected number of misses incurred by the randomized marking algorithm is at most 2 times h of k times f of delta, which is equals to big O of log k times f of delta.